عن تاريخ فيزيولوجيا الجهاز التنفسي ابن النفيس للأستاذ جون ويست من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية.
Distinguished colleagues, I have been asked by John West, who can't be here today, he gives his apologies, and has asked me to read his paper on his behalf. I hope I'm able to do it justice. Okay, so we're going to be looking at Ibn al-Nafis, pulmonary circulation, and the Islamic Golden Age. Nafis was born in Damascus, or very nearby, in 1213, commonly known as Ibn al-Nafis. His early training was in the medical college hospital there in Damascus. And at the age of 23, which the students here might be interested in, he moved to Cairo, where he worked at the Al-Nasari Hospital and subsequently at the Al-Mansuri Hospital. And his magnum opus was at the age of 29. He also came across Avicenna's canon, and he wrote an influential commentary on Avicenna's canon. And he is now recognized as being the first person to challenge, well, thought to be the first person to challenge the long-held tradition of the Galen school that blood could pass through the cardiac interventricular septum, the first person to challenge. So here we have Galen's interpretation. This is the paradigm that was formed, and that during inspiration the pneuma entered the lung through the trachea and reached the left ventricle via the pulmonary vein. Blood was formed in the liver, imbued there with natural spirit, entered the right ventricle. Most then entered the lung, but a portion passed through minute channels in the interventricular septum to the left ventricle. Here vital spirit was added, and this was distributed through the arteries to the rest of the body. The blood that reached the brain was then charged with animal spirit, which was distributed through the hollow nerves. And that was a game changer in Galen's time. He made an advance. However, as we all know, as scientists and practitioners, science is inherently provisional. And so we then come to the Islamic Golden Age, and we have here a timeline. You may have seen a very similar timeline shown by Professor Al-Hassani this morning. And as you can see, we've got the ancient Greeks and Romans, one of my great heroes, Aristotle, who I think who encouraged me from all those many centuries ago to become a biologist. And we see Galen there firmly in the Greco-Roman tradition, and his influence reaches through for 1,300 years. But there we see the Islamic Golden Age. And this is the time in which Nafis was working, and he was a great scholar of this Muslim Golden Age. He was Muslim, but not everybody who worked in science and technology at that time was Muslim. The majority were, but there were many other backgrounds, as we saw through Charles Burnett's presentation: Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, and as we go further east, Buddhist and Hindu traditions. So we see there that the Islamic Golden Age gave us Avicenna and Ibn al-Nafis, but we see Galen still, the paradigm is still continuing. Nafis, however, believed that the blood reached the left ventricle, it had passed through the lung, and he stated categorically that the intraventricular septum between the left and the right ventricles was not porous and could not allow blood to travel through it. And that was a contradiction of the Galen model. He also hypothesized that there must be small communications or pores between the pulmonary artery and vein. And that was a prediction that preceded 400 years later the discovery of the pulmonary capillaries by Malpighi. And here we have a piece of text from Nafis's commentary on anatomy in Avicenna's canon. And this is the bit that deals with the pulmonary circulation, and it states that there's no connection between the two cavities of the heart, and states that the blood cannot pass through the septum. An interesting point, and one of the enduring features of the Arabic language, is that although this was written nearly 800 years ago, it is still readable for those of you who can read Arabic. Sadly, I cannot, and I apologise. But the conservation of the language, preservation of the language and its meaning, it makes it still readable. He states that, but there is no passage between the two cavities, right and left ventricles, for the substance of the heart is solid in this region and has neither a visible passage, as was thought by some persons, nor an invisible one, which could have permitted the transmission of blood, as was alleged by Galen. The pores of the heart are are closed, and its substance is thick. There is no passage at all between these two ventricles. If the blood would penetrate the place of the spirit, the left ventricle, and spoil its substance. Anatomy refutes the contentions of former authors. On the contrary, the septum between the two ventricles is of the thicker substance than other parts, in order to prevent the passage of blood or spirits that might be harmful. It is therefore the contention of some persons to say that this place is porous is erroneous. It is based on the preconceived idea that blood from the right ventricle had to pass through this porosity, and they are wrong. And he communicated this to his students. Science uncommunicated, ladies and gentlemen, is science not done. And in a further short passage, Nafis states that there must also be small communications between the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein. And this was indeed an inspired prediction, an inspired hypothesis of the existence of the pulmonary capillaries. Because as I mentioned earlier, it was another 400 years until in the 17th century, Marcello Malpighi said in translation that there were capillaries. And in this text, he states that he is satisfied that this has been communicated to his students and that they are firm in the knowledge of the circulation and the potential presence of capillaries. One cannot begin to imagine just the way Galen's teaching held sway for 1300 years between the flowering of the Greco-Roman medical culture and then through to the beginnings of the European Renaissance, and even whilst the Islamic Golden Age was established and functioning. William Harvey attended Cambridge University in the late 1500s. He was introduced to Galen's writing. In fact, some of Galen's writing was still being followed in the 18th century. So in the 1700s, kind of current era. However, when we reach the European and Northern European Renaissance, we start to see Galen being questioned, And central to that was Michael Servetus, who noted, however, this communication is not made through the middle wall of the heart, as is commonly believed, but by a very ingenious arrangement of the refined blood is urged forward from the right ventricle of the heart over a long course through the lungs and is treated by the lungs, becomes reddish yellow, and is poured from the pulmonary artery into the pulmonary vein. He published that in a theological treatise, and parts of what he was saying was considered, other things he said too, were considered heretical by both Catholics and Calvinists. And as a result, the poor individual was burnt alive in Geneva at a tragically young age, and only 3 copies of his book survive today. There's a lot of debate, and John West in his paper will go through some of the debates on whether Servetus was aware of Nafis's work, and the suggestion that he might not have been, and might indeed be a co-discoverer of this model of pulmonary physiology. We have his pupils and collaborators. We've got Vesalius, Columbus, and then later William Harvey and Malpighi. And as I said, Galen's work continued to hold sway well into the 18th century. The final slide actually is a nice bit of backstory for students and supervisors. The Tatawi connection. So it's a fascinating sideline on Ibn al-Nafis and how his manuscript was semi-lost to the Western world and was only really rediscovered by the West 80 years ago by Tatawi, a young Egyptian physician, and he was doing his studies in a Prussian state library in Berlin, and he came across the documents, and he, of course, because he could speak Arabic, could read them, could translate them, and incorporate them into his doctoral thesis on the history of medicine for the Albert Ludwig University at Freiburg in Breisgau in Germany. He finished his studies successfully, and he returned to his homeland in Egypt, where he worked as for the Egyptian Public Health Service and was working in provisional towns doing the work of a jobbing physician, and his research ground to a halt. However, Max Meyerhoff wrote a short commentary on Dr. Tatawi's thesis and saved it from oblivion. And just like Servetus, who had the 3 books surviving, there were only 5 typewritten copies of this thesis ever made. And Meyerhoff published it in German, French, and English to make sure that it could be disseminated across the globe. And he made sure that all the relevant parts of the commentary of Ibn Nafis were included. And part of that document includes the reproduction of the Arabic texts. So please do, if you're a student of medicine, do think of contributing to preserving the great traditions and history of medicine in the Islamic Golden Age. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
شكرا على هذه